Okay guys, so in this video I'm going to walk you through the things that we've implemented in order to create a general channel, or at least the first steps to creating a general channel. So let's get into it. So not much has changed here. If we have a look at like the UI and so forth, basically it's pretty much the same. The main thing that has changed is that if I type in that box there, you see that there's now a message with this random username that that person is typing. And if I go back and actually remove that, you see that that message is gone. Apart from that, we have started making some network calls as well and things of this nature. So if I go and I do a network call like this, we can now see that, hey, the general channel here actually goes over, it's actually going to come over the network. So basically we have a few network calls now. This is the first one where we basically just list all the channels that we are connected to. And then we also, of course, have the WebSocket communication that goes on between us and the server. So we see here that these are the frames that are coming in. If I start typing, you will see that, hey, someone stopped typing, someone started typing. We actually see that there is a username being sent over, which is coming from this client here. And if I remove all of that, you'll see that it keeps on going, where we actually, we're just receiving a bunch of notifications over WebSocket connection. And that's about it, really. So let's have a look at how all of this is implemented. So the first thing that has changed is that we've added a dependency to Mongoose. So we're going to use MongoDB for this. And then in the server, we're simply adding a connection to MongoDB here. And we're just going to check a environmental variable. Or if we don't have one of those defined, we're simply going to use a default. And that's about it, really. If we now look at our application, there's quite a few things that have changed here, so let's just walk through all of that. So first and foremost, we now have a few events that we are listening to on our Socket.io our WebSocket basically. So if a user starts typing, we're going to emit that event with the user's name to all the listeners basically, and the same thing goes for stop typing. If a user sends a message, we are simply going to extract the information that is relevant, like the user ID, the channel ID, and the text, and we're going to create a timestamp. And then we have this new service called message service that is going to create this new message. It's going to store it to the database, and that's about it, really. And then we send back the created message to the original socket, and also we broadcast all of the to the other listeners, basically. Apart from that, we've added some JSON parsing so that we can actually access these two endpoints here, because we want to be able to separate between WebSocket communication and HTTP communication, because things that need to be in real time, like actually people chatting and stuff like that, that's a lot, it makes sense to have that over a WebSocket, but it doesn't make much sense to list all the channels, for example, over a WebSocket. That might as well just be HTTP. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So we can now actually grab all the channels and respond with all the channels. Same thing goes for here. We can create a channel and then that's about it, and we just do that over regular HTTP. And then finally I've added a handler for errors, so that if there is an error and there is a status code associated with that, we're going to set the status to that. Otherwise we're simply going to set it to 500, and then we send back our error message as a JSON object. Now the reason why I do this is because I've added this little function here called catch error, and basically all catch error is a little convenience function that I like to make, where I pass in a function and I return a function that has the same signature as you may recognize from Express, like from the other endpoints. But basically it's just going to be, we are expecting a function that takes a request, a response, and a next, and then we wrap all of that in a resolved promise, and then we call that function with these inputs, and then we add a catch clause with the next onto there as well. And basically what that allows us to do is to avoid having to, like when we write async await style of asynchronous code, we don't have to add any try catches here to handle the error case, because we're actually handling the errors within this function. So that's about it really. And then we've added a bunch of services to our services file here. We can actually go and look at that. So we have quite a few new services. We're not using all of them right now, but they very naturally started growing on me when I was working. So we're going to use them in the coming videos. So we have a channel service, a channel model, we have a message service, a message model, a user service, user model, and then we simply just instantiate all of these services and then we export them for convenience purposes so that we can grab them in, well, basically here, channel service and message service. And the reason I like to do this thing where I pass in the model is for testing purposes. Now we haven't added any test right now because I don't really like, we could do that as well for these services, but they are fairly straightforward at this point. There's no real logic, so there's not much value into it. But what's nice about this is that by passing the services in as a dependency to our or the models into our services, we can actually mock away all of these database accesses that would be required if we didn't do this. So I can actually fake, say, the channel model and actually just fake all of the interfaces when I want to write my test. I don't actually have to access the database in order to run my test, which is pretty nice. So we have the channel model, which is right now dirt simple. We just have a name and the amount of users that are going to be in that channel. And here's our channel service, which is fairly straightforward. It's just creating a channel, getting a specific channel, and getting a lot of channels, or getting all of them basically. And then we have our message, which is just going to be a user ID, a channel ID, when the message was created, and the text to start off with at least. And our message service is also fairly simple. We can create a message and we can get the message. And our user model is also fairly simple right now. We don't even have the concept of a password. We're just going to have a name and last visited channel. And then we have a user service, and that's basically a very similar thing. Like, we can create a user, we can get a user, we can get all the users, or we can set last visited channel. And yeah, this logic here is, we'll touch on this later, more later on, but basically this is just preparation code, because in the next video we're going to have to support being able to log in, because without a user account it becomes very tricky for us to, well, we need to have a user account in order to distinguish who has access to what and so forth. But that's coming up in the next video. And we can see here that our main file, which is where we initialize all of our different modules for the client-side code, has grown quite a bit. So if we go here, we can see that now we have a connection to our WebSocket using socket.io, or actually specifically the client version. And we're simply going to store that on the window object. And then we moved our reducers in here because we want to initialize the sidebar and the chat state. We just want to initialize that before all of these modules are loaded, so that they are actually in our state in our global state or our shared state before we actually start our application or like bootstrap all of our components. And then we've created these listeners, so when a user starts typing, we dispatch a message or an action, set typing user. So we grab the username and express that, hey, that user is now typing. And same thing goes for stop typing, and then we have a stub for messages, which we will implement later. And then basically we have quite a few things that have changed here in the chat as well, which we can see. Like, we can actually just walk through this. So I just added this random, is what we saw earlier. I just have this random username for now so that we can actually just send messages with some type of meaningful content, because we're going to implement users in the next story. So we don't want to focus on that right now. And we can see here that post message has gotten a little bit of a change as well. I've just extracted some of the logic into helper functions that, like, it's the same logic, it's just with a bit of an update. And now we're actually emitting, like, for example, send message is now actually going to emit a message over the network like this. And this is what we saw in the previous video. So that's about it. The thing that changed in post messages, like the primary thing, is that now we need to express, okay, when did a user start typing and when did they stop? And so we rewrote this logic a little bit so that we basically check that because post message is going to be this function gets called whenever a user lifts their finger off the keyboard or a specific key, which is exactly what we want, because when that happens, we want to check if the text area, if there's any content inside of it. If there is no content, then we simply say that, hey, this content area, as we did earlier, we are just gonna set back the height to 0, so that if we have like a if we have a look here, if we have a really high area, because as you see it's actually growing to a certain point, but if we do that, we want it to actually go back to the original size, and that's what we're doing here. And then we are of course also sending the message saying that, hey, this person stopped typing. And the same thing goes for the reverse, that we actually started typing. And then that's about it, really. We have one thing that changed as well for our, which is we've added some on-event handling here. Basically, what we want to do is that we want to know when a user started typing, as we saw earlier in the main file. When the socket actually gets a message saying that, hey, this user started typing, we're going to dispatch this message. We're going to grab all the users that are typing, or rather that has a state of typing, either they are typing or they're not typing, and then we're going to simply get all the users that are typing. And if there are more than one person typing, we're simply going to set the text content of our typings component, which is this thing here. Basically this, if we have a look at the diff here, so previously it just was hard-coded someone is typing, but now we just have this empty object, which is going to be, or this empty element rather, that we simply want a ref to, so that we can actually set the text, and that's what we're doing here. So if more than one person is typing, several people are typing. If there's exactly one person, then we grab that user's username and say that we simply say that that person is typing. And if nobody's typing, we simply set it to empty, so that there is no content. And then we've added a few, like the chat action that sends that message, an event for that message, and then here is our reducer. So basically, let's look at the initial state as well. So the typing users is just an object. And basically what we're doing is that we want to express it's basically a switch. We want to know if a user is typing yes or no. So in order to do this without a lot of unnecessary searching and stuff like that, we simply made typing users into an object so that we can actually set the user's username to the key, and the value is going to be whether or not a Boolean value, whether or not they're typing. So if a user's name is false, they're not typing. If it's true, they are typing. And yeah, that's about it. So in the header we changed a few small things as well, because now that we are getting a channel, like a channel is no longer just a string, it's actually an object with a name. We can actually look at the initial state of that. So we can see here that the selected channel was previously just an empty string, but now we have both all the channels in an array, and the selected channel now can actually have two things, which is both a name and an ID. So that's about it, really. And I've just added a small module for what a channel represents within the system, and then it's basically we're just grabbing the name for now, but we're going to most likely enrich this a little bit more later on. Cool. So what else has changed? We have a load channel. Well, we changed the channels list so that, because now we're getting things from the network, right? So if we have a look at that, what basically is happening here is that we're simply going to go to the stored state, and we're going to get like the array of channels that we saw earlier, and then we're simply going to do a find. We're going to go through all of the channels, we're going to look at the name, and we're going to check if the selected channel, because when we're actually selecting an element within our list, we're going to pass in the channel name, and then we're just going to check if, like, hey, give me the channel that has that name. And then we're just going to dispatch a message saying that, hey, that's the channel that was selected. And then we're simply going to toggle off set that to be the selected element. And that's about it, really. And yeah, it's a few small name changes here, nothing major. Like as you can see here, like originally we got the channels from the props, as we'll get a reminder of that in just a moment, but now we're actually getting the channels from the stored state instead. And that makes sense because the stored state is going to be updated, but this is just going to update on the initial render, which is not what we want. We want this to actually be there. We just want to grab it from the stored state instead of props. And then we have our direct message, which is just going to have basically the same logic here. Nothing major has changed there. I haven't updated this even because it's not needed right now. Direct messages is going to be for later. And then there's quite a few things that have changed here as well. So basically we are now importing set channel, get channel, and create channel. We can actually look at the file here. So I've wrapped all of this in a closure because I want to be able to use, like, I need to await a few things. So what's going to happen here is that we are going to import the set channels actions, and then we've added an API for our channels. We can actually go and look at that immediately. So basically this is just a little bit helper file that exports a few methods that are, or functions that are going to help us talk to the network. So we have a request, which is like this simple little object here, which is just going to represent a method and some data. And it's just going to set the headers. Like, it just represents a request for our for the fetch function, and that's about it really. And there's nothing much more to it. So basically what we do is, if we go back here, it's that we're going to create a channel, we're going to create a post request with the name, and then we're just going to make a fetch, and then we're just going to return the response, like the parse JSON from that. And get channels does very much the same thing, right? Right, so what we're going to do now is that we're simply going to start off by, after we bootstrapped all of these elements that are on the page, we're going to grab the channels, well, rather get channels from the network. And this is just some temporary boilerplate, temporary code, because we're going to change this behavior a little bit later, but for now this is going to be good enough. So basically what we're going to check is this: the channel's length is less than 1, in other words there are no channels, then we're going to create the general channel. But when we create when we start by creating a user, things of this nature, we would probably add that logic in there instead of having it here. This is just for testing purposes, so that we can kind of bootstrap up some stuff before we get into to that part of the code. So then we set channels to that array, and then we're simply going to set all the channels, and that's about it really. Nothing much more has changed here. If I look through here, yeah, no, that's about it really. So when we load this component up, or our sidebar, it's just going to grab all the channels, and if there is no channel, it's going to create the general channel. Cool. So a few things have been added here. Sidebar actions. We've added a set channels action, and then we have our new events so that we can actually dispatch that. And the sidebar reducer, which is just gonna, it's just gonna set that channels array to whatever we dispatch, and that's about it really. So quite a few things changed here, and there's quite a, the application is growing in complexity, but I think we're doing pretty well. So we'll just move that to ready for testing, and next up we are going to create the login so that we can start adding some users to our chat room.